Well, hello, I'm Alejandro Jara, and greetings from a very cold morning in Santiago, Chile. Welcome to you all. Welcome, Alice. I'd like to say a few words about the Friends of Multilateralism Group. It's a group that we created way back in 2016. Concerned about the situation of the multilateral trading system and with the purpose of promoting multilateralism and international trade. We are a group of independent experts, former trade diplomats like myself, or civil servants, WTO and of international governmental organizations, NGOs and academia and other stakeholders. We have grown and expanded and have been able to operate in times of pandemic by providing a platform online for the most part in these recent years, bringing together governments, international agencies, business, NGOs, and other stakeholders to discuss specific issues and promote a better understanding, a better dialogue and engagement. In today's world, after so much unilateralism that we have seen, the pandemic, the global inflation, the paralysis of the dispute settlement system of WTO, the results of the ministerial conference MC12 of WTO are to be welcome, especially when very few expected any results at all. But the name of the game is still the name of the big game is still reform of the multilateral trading system. Otherwise, many would agree that the system would not survive without reform. In this sense, MC12 is not very encouraging, some would say, with a wording too vague concerning reform. But a few meaningful steps were taken, and one to be highlighted is fisheries subsidies. And this after having struggled since 2001 to achieve an agreement, while the resources, the fisheries resources, have been constantly being deteriorated. And the results that we have on the table are not easy to understand and not easy to assess. But fortunately, we have with us Alice Tipping. She holds a Bachelor of Laws and a Bachelor of Commerce and Administration in Victoria University, Wellington. She joined the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade of New Zealand, and amongst many other responsibilities, she was posted to the Permanent Mission of New Zealand to the WTO. Later on, she joined the International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development, IISD, as Program Manager for Environmental and Natural Resources. And when the ICTSD ceased to function, she joined the IISD, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, where she works now as a lead on sustainable trade and fisheries resources subsidies. And Alice, over the years, has worked very hard, perhaps many would say too hard. Her husband
I might say that too. It's built hard.
On fisheries subsidies, and I had the personal pleasure of working with her closely on these issues, and we now look forward to your views. First of all, I'd like to ask what is your assessment of the impact in terms of quality, and that is also the quality of the disciplines, and that is also tied up with the question of timing. Implementation of this agreement takes 2/3, approval of 2/3 of the members of the WTO. Now, if you take as a proxy what happened with the amendment to TRIPS, that it took from the agreement in 2005 with close to right, and it only entered into force 12 years later, 2017. So we hope that this now does not take too long to be approved, ratified by governments, because the results are badly needed. And then, of course, for example, developing countries have 2 years to adapt their subsidies to the obligations under agreement. So that's my first question to you, Alice, and welcome once again.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Alejandro, for the very kind introduction. It has been a pleasure to work with you and so many other diplomats and negotiators and leaders of trade ministries and of the multilateral trade system to finally get this agreement over the line. And thank you very much indeed to the Friends of Multilateralism for giving me the opportunity maybe to put on record my, my take of where we've got to and maybe where we go next. So maybe to answer the first question, so we went into MC12, as we call it, last week, with a very well prepared, quite comprehensive text of disciplines that had been negotiated amongst members over years and years and years and years. It was by far the farthest the negotiations had ever gotten to, right? We had chair's text in the past, but this text, rather than being sort of the chair's attempt to solomonically come down with the best possible agreement, was in fact a really negotiated text from the bottom up. So it contained an article on subsidies to illegal fishing, an article on subsidies to already overfished stocks, and then a broader article on subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing more generally. And those were the articles, the rules that members themselves had proposed for this agreement. And those of you who are familiar with the CPTPP and the USMCA agreements will see some really clear similarities, right? So those two agreements already contain rules on subsidies to illegal fishing, subsidies to overfished stocks. So no surprises where the inspiration for those rules came from. And so we went into MC12 with pretty stable texts, frankly, on the illegal subsidies article, on the overfished subsidies article, and a very stable, I would say, structure for the last big set of subsidies on overcapacity and overfishing. Where the disagreements really remained were on the special and differential treatment exceptions to the main prohibition in that last article, so the exceptions that would apply to developing country members. And it won't be any surprise to this audience just how sensitive those discussions were and just how far apart members were on some of these points, right? So the Indian government was saying extremely clearly, including in very impassioned speeches by their minister in the heads of delegation meetings in MC12, that they required 25 years before any subsidies to their commercial fishing fleet would be subject to any fisheries management requirement whatsoever. Others said 25 years is far too long, how about 5, right? So what was interesting was that they were at least talking about numbers, and I found that encouraging, because when you're talking about numbers, you have a limited bound of possibility, and you move towards each other if you want to. And the big question in all of our heads was, do they really want to get an agreement done, right? The feeling certainly was, there is an agreement here to be done, a deal here to be struck if they want to strike it. And I think so the conference was, as many of these ministerial conferences are, somewhat unpredictable and chaotic, because you're never quite sure, once an agreement goes up to ministers, quite what they're going to think of it and how the dynamics between them as individuals will play out. And so there was a lot of uncertainty, right? I mean, frankly, until the very last moment about whether this deal would come through. And what became clear, maybe after about day 3 of the ministerial, was that the differences of opinion around those numbers, I mean, 25 years was one example, but there were others, that the differences of opinion there were not getting closer, right? The gap was not narrowing fast enough for the whole agreement to be agreed by the time the conference was meant to finish. And the conference was extended once properly, and then just by default into early Friday morning. And so at some point, And really only the people in the room know exactly kind of how this decision was taken. At some point, the decision was taken to jettison, to use a kind of marine metaphor, to jettison the most difficult parts of Article 5, the big article on overcapacity and overfishing, in order to save the rest of the fisheries deal. And this was, I think, an extremely difficult decision for many members to make. Very difficult for, some members who had been pushing for a very ambitious comprehensive agreement. And for those members who felt like they were bearing this sacrifice most keenly, the trade-off essentially comes in two forms. Firstly, there's a note in the ministerial declaration that says we will continue to work towards a comprehensive agreement by MC13. And there's also a very interesting sort of self-destruct clause in the treaty. So Article 12 of the treaty, not something I have ever seen before, says members shall reach agreement on a more comprehensive version of this agreement within 4 years of its entry into force, or the whole agreement expires. Right, so there's a push at the beginning to get the negotiations done by MC13, and there's a very clear drop-off point at the end. Right, so the drop-off point, of course, has a slight nuance in it. Members can agree, the General Council can agree to keep the agreement going, even if they don't reach agreement within those 4 years. But so that was essentially the trade-off that was constructed in the very last hours of the negotiation, when, just the weight of the disagreement about the exceptions and the main prohibition was threatening to sink the whole thing. So how do I assess it? I assess it as, it was, I think, the very limit of what was politically possible between those members in that ministerial at that moment. And there were many points, I will confess, when I didn't think that the agreement was going to happen at all. There were many points when the disagreements over the numbers and then the disappointment with the idea of the smaller package was such that I didn't think anything was going to go through at all. I thought that was more or less the end of this agreement and this beautiful dream that we had that the WTO would respond to the crisis of global fisheries. So I don't take for granted what was achieved. I think it was politically as much as could have been achieved at that point. There's been, some quite loud criticism of the deal and of the fact that it doesn't specifically address subsidies, capacity enhancing subsidies, that we lost this main prohibition. And those critics are right as well, right? So we did as much as we possibly could, but there's a lot left to do, right? There's still a big agreement, a big prohibition, a big part of these disciplines that needs to be finalized in order for the agreement to have an impact not only on the very worst red light kinds of subsidies, but on the sort of orange light situations where we need to be very careful. So glass half full, glass half empty, glass even a bit more than half full, I guess is my assessment. Oh, I think you're on mute, Alejandro. Go ahead. Alejandro, you're still on mute.
Thank you very much. That was crystal clear. Let me follow up. So we have part of the glass is empty, so there's much work to be done. Mm-hmm. We have this termination clause, which is very difficult to understand, let alone imagining how it's going to be applied, if at all. But let me approach this in a different way. To the best of my knowledge, illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing is a small part of the problem in terms of how much subsidies go into IUU compared to subsidies that go to overfishing and overcapacity. So important as it may be, we're still a long way from solving the bulk of the problem. So we have now disciplines of overfishing and we have pending overcapacity. So in terms of how much of the subsidies are we disciplining now with this agreement, what what is the percentage of the effort that has been made or that still has to be made in the near future?
And I think the problem is there's no way of knowing exactly what percentage we've covered and what we haven't, because of the way the rules are designed, right? So firstly, any implementation of any agreement will always depend on, or the impact of any agreement will always depend on how it's implemented. So, and we're not really sure how governments are going to implement this yet. That's our next job. But the nature of the rules that we have is that they are very much focused on subsidies in particular situations, right? So, you know, the rule on subsidies to illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing doesn't say all subsidies to IUU fishing. It says all subsidies to a vessel when that vessel is found to have been IUU fishing. Now, obviously, not every vessel involved in IUU fishing gets caught, so it will be it's an important, significant deterrent kind of rule, right? Rather than one that says we are going to pretend that we're removing all subsidies from all illegal fishing. We're not, but we are forcing governments to think about when they determine that a vessel has been fishing illegally, are they subsidizing that vessel? And should they think about not subsidizing that vessel and how long for, right? And similarly with the overfished stocks rule, we're not prohibiting all subsidies to all fishing of all overfished stocks, partly because there are a number of quite wide exceptions in that rule that I don't love, but there they are. So governments can continue to provide subsidies to overfished stocks if the subsidies are designed to help rebuild the stock, right? If you're changing from a net with a very fine mesh that catches lots of juveniles to a net with very wide mesh that lets the juveniles out, that will help to rebuild the stock. That's a subsidy that would be allowed in that situation. So it will really depend on how governments implement the rules before we know what impact they're going to have. So I know that's a bit unsatisfying, but I think that's the reality of the rules we have.
So beyond the political difficulties and in terms of the timing of entry into force of this agreement, what you're telling us now is that there are questions around the implementation, and this would require a lot of work by the committee on fisheries subsidies that is now created, and it would require a great deal of transparency. And in this respect, when I read the text, I see that it relies heavily on governments to be transparent about what they do or not. And they're not famous for being very transparent.
Correct.
Therefore, I think this effort will require contribution by others, international agencies, by think tanks, NGOs, IISD, and others to contribute with their knowledge and their capacity to gather information and organize it to help the implementation of this agreement.
I think you're exactly right. And, you know, it's sort of, I know that the topic of this talk is fisheries subsidies, but, you know, I think also about some of the other agreements reached at MC12, some of which, you know, like fisheries, are not the kind of the perfect, comprehensive, legally binding agreement that we might all have wanted, and whose impact is going to depend on how governments read the text that they've agreed to and how they implement it. I mean, the decision on World Food Programme exports is the perfect case in point. The first paragraph talks about not restricting exports for the World Food Programme. The second paragraph says, except when you might want to do that for your own food security. So, you know, so I think I had the sort of sense that in WTO practice, we're moving away from rules where their implementation will be very clear and very constrained and very enforced by compulsory dispute settlement. We're moving more into rules where it's not entirely clear how governments are going to implement it. And exactly as you're saying, there's much more of a responsibility and a role for organizations outside governments to show what's going on to bring some transparency where governments may or may not wish there to be, and to create some moral pressure to have implementation go in a more positive direction, right? We can't just rely on the WTO dispute settlement system to push for implementation in the right direction any longer.
Well, let's hope that all these issues and problems do not lead parliaments around the world to question and maybe refuse to approve the agreement, because it looks from many points of view rather than complete. They should see it more as a process. Let me ask you perhaps two last questions. One is, what is pending now will require not so much a technical discussion over the month to come, 1-2 years, whatever, it seems to me, because a lot of the technical work has already been done. As you say, it's more about numbers, about political determination. But what are the linkages within the agreement, and are there linkages to other issues beyond fisheries?
A good question. I guess my sense is that the package that we have on fisheries is relatively well balanced internally, right? There were, there were issues that some members were pushing very strongly for, and others they felt defensive on, both of which, and at the end, many issues were simply drawn out of the final package. So my sense is the final package is relatively well balanced in terms of members' interests. And I think the challenge perhaps is going to be to try and sort of construct another little mini package of what is left that is relatively well balanced again internally. Because then of course you come to the question of the linkages with other things, right? I mean, the sense that I've heard a few people say since MC12 finished is that the next MC, Ministerial Conference, so Ministerial Conference 13, should probably be one that's focused on agriculture, on the 7 issues that are still on the agricultural work program and haven't been resolved, and still on food security, right? I don't think anyone's under any illusions that the current food crisis is going to go away quickly. So there's at least, it's only been a few days, but there was sort of a sense that the next ministerial should probably be focused on agriculture. And so the interesting sort of scenario that sets up is, what could you construct in terms of an additional fisheries mini package to add to what we have in the context of a discussion that's more about agriculture? And the interesting sort of potential link there, is that of the pieces of the fisheries puzzle that were left behind, one of the big complaints was that there were too many exceptions from the main prohibition for developed countries, right? So there was a qualifier that said you can provide all these subsidies if you have fisheries management in place. And many developing countries felt that that was making it too easy for the developed countries. So if we went straight back to where we were and nothing changed, and perceptions didn't change, then the question would be, if that is the balance that we're looking at in the fisheries mini package, should we be looking for some more concessions from developed countries on agriculture? Would that be a way of balancing a kind of agriculture and fisheries package for MC13? This is pure idle speculation, I don't know. But these are probably the discussions and the thinking that's going to go around in people's heads for the next few months.
As a matter of fact, I heard from someone that the EU has already said that they fully comply with the agreement as it is, that they don't have to stop any subsidies. Anyway, my last question is, and in the context of what you have said about what needs to be done for MC13 and there beyond, is a termination clause. And it's very puzzling, and I don't know if you can provide any insights, but it says that if comprehensive disciplines are not adopted within 4 years, of the entry into force of this agreement, now that could be in 10 years' time or whatever, and unless otherwise decided by the General Council, this agreement shall stand immediately terminated. Now, what is the default? Who determines whether the comprehensive disciplines have or not been adopted? And therefore, how is this going to be, on what basis is it going to be decided in the light of the need to have a decision made by consensus? Is this clause really operational?
It's a good question, Alejandro, and I don't know that I know. I mean, I suppose off the top of my head, it will be clear whether we have agreement to amendments, right, or not. So the question is, might some members withhold their agreement to those amendments because they don't think they're good enough? These are the sorts of games that governments play, and I think we can probably expect them to play those games when we eventually get to this point. I think that's inevitable. So, I think it was designed to be as clear and as strict and as severe a provision as could be put in to reassure those who felt upset about what had been jettisoned that the rest would be eventually included, right? And that they would not be left without their comprehensive package at the expense of the whole thing. What games governments will play once we get close to the end of those 4 years, you and I can only imagine. We'll see. I don't know.
Alice, on that note, I wish you very well, and I trust that you continue to work in this field. You have contributed much over the years, and I believe that the world is in your debt, and I hope that this debt will increase over the years to come as you keep on the very good work that you and your colleagues have done. FMG thanks you profusely for your contribution, and I bid you a very good evening in Geneva time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Alejandro, and thank you to the Friends of Multilateralism Group as well. Thank you.
Thank you.